Okay, let's get started in unit number 5, percent ratio and rate. We are going to be talking about percent first. In this video, we're going to be talking about a couple of different things, where you may find percents, decimals, and fractions in real life, and the process on how you might convert or change between the format of percent, decimals, and fractions. So, let's get started. Everyone uses percents, decimals, and fractions in their daily life. We see them in, for example, bank loans. When we are looking to go and borrow money from an establishment, they might give us a percent rate of interest. Same as you, when you put money into a bank account, you're essentially loaning the bank your money, and they pay you a percent of interest. Usually the one you get is a little bit lower than the business, but it's very important to know how that percentage can affect the money that you either borrow from the bank or give to the bank. Another example of percent found in daily life is probability of precipitation. We've had a lot of snow this year, and when you're driving out to work or you're driving into the city, you often would have to think about what are the chances that it's going to rain, even if you're just thinking about what you're going to wear that day. So weather people or meteorologists, they tell us that there's going to be a 50% chance of rain. You probably want to take with you an umbrella or a raincoat. Third, we see measurements, of course, often in many different types of professions. A chef would use 2 3/4 cups of water. That's a fraction. You might use 0.5 of a liter of oil in a car if you're a mechanic, and if you're a carpenter, you might use 6 feet and 3/4 of an inch of 2x4. Those measurements are something that you would have to be able to understand and at times convert between. And last, notation of large numbers. If we were talking about the population of a large city, for example, instead of saying 1,200,000 people live in the Greater Toronto Area, we could say 1.2 million people. It sounds a little bit easier. It's a little bit easier for us to understand. It's a lot less of a mouthful, that's for sure. And when we use it to communicate, people will still understand what we're talking about. So if we were to take this fine gentleman on the right-hand side here, we'd note that he is surrounded by beautiful cars and lots of numbers and words. Everyone, as they get a little bit older, is going to encounter somebody like this when they go to get their first car. Hopefully you don't stumble into this man's establishment because it's quite confusing looking, and it looks like it probably wouldn't work out for you in the best way possible. But let's say you did go in there and he were to tell you, welcome to Stan's Fine Automobiles. Have I got a deal for you? We've got the deal of the week, 50% off. And you were to say, well, that sounds awesome. That sounds great. I'm going to take that right off the hop. I'm going to buy that car, 50% off, whatever the price was. Odds are good you're going to be getting quite a good deal. If that deal of the week, though, is only half a car, you're not really getting as much of a deal as you think. So when we look at percentage, decimals, and fractions, it's really all about perspective and how you look at things. People often think of percents, most commonly I would say, especially at your age, as outcomes in a test. If we were to look at this fella here, he's looking a little down in the dumps, probably because he sees himself as a fraction full. We would call that half full. If we were to talk about him in percentage, we would be talking about him as 50% full. And if we were talking about him in a decimal, we would be talking about 0.5. So he sees himself as half full. If we were to look at it a different way, we could see perhaps that he is, instead of being half full, he's half empty, which would be sad. These guys over here see themselves as half full. And when combined, they equal something completely different. If we take these guys on the left-hand side and we represent them as a collective fraction, they would be, if we were to use the same model as over here, 2 out of 2. So that's 1 full glass of blue Smurf juice. And if we were to convert that into a percentage, we would have 100% of a glass. Decimals, we would multiply that 0.5 by 2, and we would have 1.0. So we can see here in this example that collectively we have 100% of a glass of Blue Smurf juice. And over here we have 50% of a glass of orange juice. And we can identify that fractions, percents, and decimals can equal less than a whole or a whole, but they can also mean more than a whole. So if we were to take these three guys over here, sorry, three and a little bit, I suppose. If we were to take them and represent them as fractions and decimals, again, identifying with the same denominator, and we put our f down, we know that we've got a denominator of 2. We have 2, 4, 6, and a half, so one more, is 7 out of 2. So that fraction we would call an improper fraction, and we would convert that to a mixed number. And that mixed number is the denominator divided into the numerator, which 2 divided into 7 is 3. And then we would have 1 left over, which would leave us 3 and 1/2. If we were to represent that as a percentage, we know that we have 100%, 100%, 100%, and 50%. So if we have 100, 100, 100, and 50, we would have 350% of one glass of green juice. And if we were to go down here to the old decimal, now what do? Well, we know that when we have a decimal of a whole, it's 1.0. So 100% is 1.0. If we look at this percentage here, and we do the exact same thing, we would understand that in order to get this, we would have to move the decimal place over 2 spots and be left with a decimal of 3.5. So all of these are equivalent, whether they are less than, 1 whole, or more than. Let's go through a couple examples and see if we can figure that out. So this is how we would do it with our cups of juice. If we were to go on to another example here for a practice run, we want to convert these things mathematically. We would need to do 2 things. And I would ask you to note down here at the bottom, the best way to represent these 3 forms whenever you've got them is to convert them into a percent right from the start, as soon as you possibly can. So how I would do that is the following. Here we have the answers, what these are equivalent to, as we discussed in the last example. I would take my fraction and I would convert that into a percent. If I didn't know these right now, I would convert this fraction into a percent. How I would do that is I would turn that bottom denominator into 100. The easiest way to convert that bottom denominator into a 100 is to multiply it by 100. And remember that with fractions, what you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. So we would do the exact same thing to the top, and what we would end up with is 100 over 200. Now, we need to convert this bottom denominator right here into 100. Now, using our mathematical skills, we know that if we were to divide this by 2, it would give us 100. Again, remembering what we do to the bottom, we have to do to the top. We divide the top by 2. When we divide the top by 2, we get 50. And when we divide the bottom by 2, we're now at 100. So we've taken our fraction and we've converted it into a fraction that is represented with a denominator of 100. So that 50 automatically tells us what our percent is going to be, because all percents, of course, are numbers measured out of 100. So we would measure that now, or call that 50%. Once you have your percent, you're good to go with your decimals. And how you can convert your decimals is almost just as easy. We're just going to slide this 50 over 100 right over here. And we want to convert this into something that's just over 1. So what we do is we take away these zeros. So we imagine that there's a decimal here and a decimal here, and we just slide this over to the right because decimals are measured in 1. So when we slide those two decimals over, we end up with a 1.00. What we do to the bottom, we have to do to the top. So let's slide those two over, and we get 0.5. Once we've got that, we've got our decimal. We always want to represent that 0 in front of the decimal just for consistency and to make sure that we know that there's nothing in front of that decimal. So all of these, 1/2, 0.5, and 50% represent less than 1 whole. So that was pretty easy though. Let's try one that's a little bit more difficult. So we're going to take this fraction here that we have, 18 over 23, and I want you to follow the exact same thing that I did on the last page. I'm going to take that 18 over 23, and I'm going to multiply the bottom by 100, and I'm also going to do the same thing to the top. What I get when I do that is 1800 over 2300. Now, to convert this 1800 over 2300 into a percentage or something that's over 100, I would have to divide the bottom by 23. When I divide the bottom by 23, that equals 100. When I divide the bottom by 23, I have to remember to divide the top by 23 as well. And 1800 divided by 23 equals 78.2608696. We would just take to 2 decimal places. So you have 78.26 out of 100. This is our percentage, 78.26%. So now we've got our percent. All we need to do is find our decimal. So when we're looking for our decimal, remember we talked about that. We represent the decimal with this right here, and we just got to slide those decimals over. So let's just write it down, 78.26 over 100. Fractions don't like decimals. So let's take our decimal from our 100, slide it over till we have our 1. We do the exact same thing to the top one, and we end up with 0.7826. There we go. We've got our fraction, an equivalent decimal, and an equivalent percentage. All of these would be the exact same. All right? So there we've gone from a fraction to a decimal to a percent. What if you've just got the percent? Well, you have to take what you know and do the exact same thing. Here we have 38.4%. So if we have 38.4%, we just reverse the process that we used in the last one. We take our 38.4 and we put it over top of 100. If we have 38.4 over 100, we want to get rid of our decimal. If we want to get rid of that decimal to form a fraction, we slide the decimal the opposite direction. However, as we said before, if we want to be able to move that decimal, we have to make sure that we've got something on the bottom. So what we would do is every time we slide that decimal over, we add 1 0. So when we add that 0, we now have a complete fraction. So now we've got our answer for right over here. 384 over 1,000. And that means that we have 384 1,000ths. If we were going to do it with a decimal, we would take again our fraction, our original fraction of 38.4 over 100, which is our percent, and we would have to slide our decimal the opposite direction that we did to get our fraction. So we would go 1, 2, right there, and we do the exact same thing on the bottom that we do with every time we have decimals over 1. And what we end up with is 0.384. Now the cool thing about decimals and fractions is you can actually, well, I think it's cool, you can actually tell if your fraction right here, is correct by looking at the place value of your decimal. So we know that decimals work in their pieces of tens. So here we have tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. So the last digit in our number here should be in the thousands. If it is in the thousands, then our denominator for our fraction has to also be 1,000. So that's how you would convert that way. Let's do one more. Here we have 0 from a decimal to percent to a fraction. We have 0.347. Now, we've already worked in both directions from percent to fraction and from fraction to percent. So now we just have to work with decimals. So if we have our 0.347 and we want to turn it into a percentage, we know that that currently is sitting over top of a 1. So if we add 2 zeros onto the denominator, that turns it into a 100. Now all we have to do is take our decimal, we added them this way, so we have to slide our decimal this way. And we end up with 34.7 over 100. That is our percent, 34.7 over 100. Now thinking the exact same way that we did before, if we want to get rid of that 34.7 and we want to convert it into a fraction, we would go 34.7 over 100. We want to get rid of that decimal because decimals don't work in fractions. So we slide that decimal once to the right, and when we do that, we have to throw that 0 down on the bottom. When we do that, we get 347 over 1,000. Our fraction is 347 over 1,000. Easy. We look over here at our decimal and we see that we have a 3 in the tenths, a 4 in the hundredths, and a 7 in the thousandths. Our denominator is 1,000, so that matches up. And we've got our 34.7%. So when you're converting from percent, fractions, or decimals, it makes no difference. Once you understand how you're moving your decimal and that each one of these actually represents the same thing, you'll be doing fine. Okay? So, without further ado, on you go to assignment number 2.